Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ department is excited to be offering a graduate-level certificate in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. JEDI classes meet the moment with supportive learning that helps navigate an evolving Jewish community landscape. Upcoming courses include Anti-Semitism and Intersectionality, with acclaimed professor Aaron Hahn Tapper, and Environmental Justice and Jewish Perspectives, Land, People, and Power, with renowned activist and educational leader Ariella Ronai Hinich. Apply by January 12th to get in on spring classes before they begin. Just head to usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 412, Digital Jewish Citizenship. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And
I'm Miriam Turlinchamp.
And we'll explain that in a minute, but first we just want to say Happy New Year to everybody. I've made the argument that in the next era of Judaism, we should change when the new year is, because we've done that in previous iterations of Judaism. So in the Bible, it's Passover. In the Talmud, it ends up being Rosh Hashanah. And
it's around Passover, to be clear. It's the first of Nisan. It's a little before Passover.
Yes, you're right. But my personal goal is to make it so that in the next iteration of Judaism, Hanukkah is the New Year festival. But we don't have to get into that right now. That's not the topic of today's conversation. Before we jump into the topic of today's conversation, which is to look back at our series of episodes where we explored or re-explored digital Judaism, I want to just mention that our next set of short classes in the Onion Yeshiva is coming up in just about a week and a half. So it's not the very last minute, but for you procrastinators out there, I would suggest that you pause this audio right now, go to judaismunbound.com/classes, sign up for a class or two. They are fantastic, and you should check them all out, and then just come right back to this episode, because that is part of the nature of digital Judaism, is that you can pause things, and you can hop over and do something else and pick it right up again. And that is part of what we want to talk about today. So don't forget to sign up for those Onion Yeshiva courses. They are fantastic. Now to jump into this conversation, looking back at our series of episodes on digital Judaism, and there have been some times before where we have brought a third party into our debrief episodes. And it makes all the sense in the world that today we would have Miriam Turlinchamp for at least two reasons. One is that she is our new commander, and we have to make sure
she loves that title, Commander. Yeah, tell the world.
Yes, and so we have to make sure that she is really an integral part of everything that we do. We're so thrilled to have her for that reason. And also because as the new executive director of Judaism Unbound, Judaism Unbound is fundamentally a significant, I would say the most significant, but a significant player in the digital Jewish landscape. And Miriam is our fearless leader of that work. So it makes sense that how can we really think about this series of episodes on digital Judaism and the role of Judaism Unbound and all that without having Miriam Turlinchamp as part of this conversation. So Miriam, I can't welcome you to Judaism Unbound. You're part of it. So it's great to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here in this capacity.
Miriam, what should we call you on these episodes, which you will be joining us on regularly? Because you're not a guest.
I want to make a Trinity joke, but I don't think I'm supposed to at this time. I feel
so
like I'm
you're the Holy Spirit.
I'm the Holy Spirit. I feel like I'm the third leg of the stool. I'm the one who makes sure all the numbers add up.
So when you join us on these guests, you're the Holy Spirit that makes our twofold Dan and Lex into three and really completes the whole thing. So send us your angry emails about how we are assimilating into the Christian hegemony. But Miriam, we're thrilled to have you as our Holy Spirit for these debrief episodes at the end of our units.
Yeah, so actually, I think it makes sense to start with your impressions as both a listener of these episodes and also as someone who's intensely thinking about what it means to lead a digital Jewish enterprise, particularly coming from work that did include a substantial digital component in your previous job at your congregation, but wasn't maybe focused on the digital world as its sort of main focus. We've talked about we don't even know exactly what language to use. Lex is always pushing back against my older, in real life versus digital. Lex is like, no, that's not how to talk about it. So I don't even know how to formulate the question, but I think you know what I'm asking. So I'm curious what your initial thoughts are looking back at those episodes.
I think that without shade throwing into the congregational space, the virtual or online, what's the right word, Lex? I don't know.
I say online. I just use online and offline. virtual, the reason, just for those who haven't heard me rant and rave about this in the past, the reason I avoid virtual is because I think the word virtual implies something simulated. It implies something that is not real.
Yeah.
It is an attempt to be real in a way that is not quite real. And my articulation would be that us in digital space is just as real as offline space. It's just I use online and offline.
So I think that's exactly that, is that there was a realness to online life that was possible during COVID that can continue, that's outside of this sort of energy of the podcast. And I think Lexi and I sort of talked a little bit about educational initiatives in the same way that in the congregational space, I didn't like the idea that people were not watching the services directly, but I loved the idea that they were making dinner while listening or taking long walks and participating in worship in that way. And that the online life offers you this opportunity to be in the world and of the world and sort of experiencing this collective idea and community in a way that wasn't possible if you just had to sit in one seat doing the same thing. I find that this is a quick shout out to my friend CB, that they wrote in to me, they texted and they said, I found my people at Judaism Unbound. And there's a lot of people who are finding their people online in ways that are impossible to find outside of the online world, that we're connective in ways. And so to say that this is central to the future of Judaism, but also central to the connective web of people feels to me obvious, I guess.
I really, really appreciate you naming that. And yeah, I've been thinking about like offline, online for a while, but I appreciate you noting that this isn't just about the future of Judaism, it's about the now, the present of Judaism. And I even think we're reaching a place where it's part of our history. I was recently at a Jewish studies conference, and I was on a roundtable whose purpose was to shine a light on this new project that a past guest, Sandy Fox, is launching that's basically going to be an archive of the American Jewish left in the digital age, which is to say it's going to preserve certain kinds of organizational memories of organizations that have functioned mostly through digital mechanisms. So already we're creating archives, we're creating storehouses to house digital Jewish material in a way that parallels offline material. So we're reaching a place, and this is very exciting to me, that this is not just our present and future, it's also our past. That's where it's no longer reasonable to talk about it as virtual, as simulated. Like if we can have an archive about preserving a particular place, that place is not just sort of a manufactured abstraction. It is its own habitat with its own norms and struggles and advantages. And I think that advantage that is biggest that you just described, Miriam, of being able to find your people. I mean, there's more people online than in any one offline space. That's a feature of it. There are many things, and I want to be clear in this episode and always, like, I don't orient to digital Judaism as if everything that happens there is great. There are so many problems of our internet and how it's been constructed and who it serves and who it doesn't serve. There's problems with social media. There's problems with our algorithms. There's problems with search engines and what they point us to and what they don't point us to, just as there are problems and limitations to what can be achieved offline. So I want to be clear about that. But what I am so grateful for is that I think we're reaching a point where online Judaism and its growth, it's actually allowing us to see offline Judaism as a kind of Judaism and not the whole thing. I'd bring the analogy, I mean, Dan and I went to Limud in England a number of years ago, and it was so fun for me. I've talked about this a few times. It was fun for me to like be one of the Americans. Like it was a part of my identity to be from the United States. Now, I'm not here to say rah, rah, yay, America. I also don't think that, but like, there are things that I am in the world and how I act and the way my speaking voice is and whatever. Like there are things about me and how I am in the world that relate to the fact that I am from the United States of America. I've been shaped by this context. I think one problem our society has because we predominate in so many sectors of human experience is that we forget that that's actually part of what we are. That we're not just like humans, we're American humans, and that not everybody else on the planet is like us. And that's what leads the rest of the world to be like, oh, these Americans, they like have no sense of anything outside of themselves. And Miriam, you said you don't want to throw shade at congregations. I kind of do a little bit. The way that offline Jewish spaces talk about Judaism is very much from the vantage point that offline Judaism is the full widget. It is all of Judaism. And what happens digitally, to the extent it is powerful or meaningful, and they don't deny that it is, but to the extent that it's meaningful or powerful, it's that it can it can lead to mixed dancing. No, it can lead to offline Judaism. But that's kind of a joke, but like, I kind of mean it, because like it can lead to actual forms of interaction like dancing that you can't do as effectively online. So I live and I walk around and I'm like so annoyed sometimes that I have all these friends who have been shaped by, say, Christianity or cultural Christianity, and they're not aware of it. They think that they're just like people that are secular, quote unquote. And that bothers me because they're not aware of a core thing about themselves, that it's not bad, but it's like they're denying something that does inform how they act in the world. And in the same way, I think offline Jewish experiences, they're not aware of some really cool features about themselves that are different from online, because they're not even analyzing the fact of being offline. They're just treating that as what all of it is. So I know that was like kind of a strange rant to get to like Christian hegemony and Americanness in how we relate to digital Judaism. But I want us to hammer home that like offline Judaism, online Judaism, those are two different, really worthwhile, amazing contexts that Jewish stuff happens. And if we're not aware of both of them being deep and real, we're actually not only going to fall short in understanding digital Judaism, we're going to fall short in understanding offline Judaism.
Lex, my question when you set up that story about Limud and you, I mean us, but I think you embraced it more, sort of being the Americans that were there. I'm curious whether you think of yourself when you walk into an offline Jewish space as here visiting from the online country, because I don't. Like, I think you do more than I do, I suspect. I think I have like a third orientation, and it's interesting to like imagine the three orientations, right? Because orientation number one is the people who you described. They live in offline Judaism. They understand that online, they're not Luddites. I mean, they're not people who want to ban online things. There are people like that in the Jewish community, but not too many. Or to the extent that there are, not ultra-Orthodox, there are not too many. But they think that fundamentally Judaism is offline and the online is like a nice adjunct. Maybe it's a feeder, all the things that you said. Then there's people who maybe like you, certainly even younger people and other folks. It's not necessarily about age, although I think it predominates more with younger people who basically, and should be understood this way. And I don't think that a lot of them quite understand themselves this way or are understood this way, but they're almost like we've talked many times. They've already immigrated to this new land of online, and they come back periodically to visit the old country, but they're really a different kind of Jew. They're an online Jew. And then there's this third orientation, which I think that I feel like, which is somebody who, like, I guess fundamentally lives offline, but who really loves, I guess it's like a Francophile, right? Somebody who really loves to visit France, right? Or somebody who really loves to visit online and thinks it's an awesome place and knows that there's a lot of people that actually live there and admires them and doesn't fear them, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of people look at me and they think that I'm from online, but actually I'm not from there. I'm just a Francophile. I'm just somebody who appreciates it. And I just sort of wonder, Lex, like how you think of that sorting and where you see yourself in that.
Yeah, it's a really, really good thing to follow up about, because you're right. Like I do actually think of myself, I think of my primary setting, my primary Jewish context as being online. And I feel strongly about that. And the reason I feel strongly about that is not because I like it better. It's not because I feel more comfortable in digital space. I actually, in many ways, I love Providence, Rhode Island, where I live. And I've been reflecting lately on how I actually was falling short of what I wanted to be in Providence Jewish life. Not that I need to join a synagogue, but like in terms of being part of this particular community of people in Rhode Island. But I look around and I'm aware that what you just described is true. There are not people who, by and large, actively identify themselves as being first and foremost anchored in digital Jewish space. And the bigger problem is there aren't people who actively identify as gatherers or holders of that space. Until we have people for whom it's their primary anchor point, we're always going to have a problem. And we've talked about this. Like, there are synagogues that create digital Jewish programming, and sometimes it's really good. but sometimes it's not. And part of that is that when your primary work, when your organizational structure is structured around doing amazing work offline, and you also try to do online work, that's tricky. In the same way that for us, like, God willing, we're going to do lots of cool things in particular cities and in particular spaces. But like, we have shaped everything we do around online work. And there's a lot of unspoken assumptions of that work that we can send one email and get critical mass to a program. That doesn't happen if you have a smaller pool of people in a particular community to get them to something. I want to think of myself as serving this space because I think this is the space of Jews with the biggest population worldwide, digital Jewish space. It's bigger than Jerusalem. It's bigger than New York. It's bigger than whatever. But it has close to zero people who are actively like calling themselves employed by that space or serving that space. And so I think that makes it the most underserved Jewish population or Jewish community in the world. I think that on a practical level, me allocating my me-ness to online, it does a more meaningful thing than me primarily allocating my time to where I live in Providence. I do still want to do that, but it's a different level of importance because there are people that see Rhode Island as the place that they serve, and I'm thrilled to help them out, but it's not as big of a gap. So when I get asked, like, where do you work? I often will answer like, so I live in Providence, Rhode Island, but in order to helpfully answer your question, it's important for me to say that I don't work more there than anywhere else. I work anywhere where people are accessing our material, which is all around the world. And because it's mostly the United States, it's about 84% of our listenership and our people are in the United States. I do think of myself as serving American Judaism to a degree more than some other places, but mostly it's an online geography that is different from offline geography.
You know, when I first took this job, I asked Dan, like, what's your elevator pitch when you tell people what you do for a living? And so, Lex, when you just sort of summarized that way, I think it was helpful. But I think in the end, you have to think about what's the through line. If you're rooted in the online world or you're rooted in the offline world and that's your orientation, or you're the Francophile who flows through it, is there an embodied experience? I mean, there's something about the online world that when I'm seeking belonging and meaning through a Jewish context, that I can access it at any point. But we had our first board meeting since I've been executive director a couple weeks ago. And I walked in and I went straight into the arms and gave this huge hug to our president, who I'd never met in embodied form, right? I've only met him online. And yet there was an assumption of not just like a good relational connection, but like a familial connection, enough that you could embrace someone and break a bodied sort of space. And I'm wondering if that is actually what we mean by hybrid, which is that we can foster a level of belonging and connection that then serves us when we're in person. And we're in person, that we foster a level of open-mindedness, that we can then access something online that wouldn't be possible with just sort of the people in the room, and that there should be a sort of a flow in that kind of way. And that definitely screws up the elevator pitch of what we're doing. But I think if we're rooted in belonging and purpose through this lens of ancient wisdom, hopefully there is a break and it's not just one or the other.
You know, the elevator pitch, Miriam, you asked me what the elevator pitch is. I'm so bad at elevator pitches. So maybe somebody else, maybe you could turn this into an elevator pitch at some point. I think that we're doing two things, right? One, I think that we're trying to build up a really powerful space in the online world. And at the same time, we're not one of those entities that's trying to do that to the exclusion of the offline world, and to sort of imagine that something can exist that embraces both. Something occurred to me as both of you were talking, that when you think of people living in two different countries, you can imagine at least three orientations that they have to one another. One is tolerance, like, yeah, there's people in another country. I acknowledge that. I'm not going to deny it, but I'm not really that interested in them. Two is xenophobia, right? Which says, I really don't like those people, or there's something wrong with them for some reason. And I think that there tends to be a mentality to that extent, for sure, from the offline Jews toward the online Jews, probably also in many cases from the online Jews to the offline Jews, the third orientation is what I'm calling, Francophilia. I mean, obviously that has to do with France. So I don't know what the general term for it is, but it's where I say, I love the fact that there are people who live somewhere else and who are doing this thing in a different way. And I want to visit them, and I want them to visit me. And ultimately, I want to maybe find something. And we've talked, I think, in the past about the promise of the digital reality to break down some of these binaries where we can actually live in both places. And all of us live in both places. All of us live both online and offline.
Which would be dual citizenship, just to really crystallize it with your allegory.
Yeah, and so in a way, the most obvious version of that, or the most obvious conversation that we had that kind of shows a possibility, was with Brett Lockspizer. Not surprisingly, the guy invented Safaria. He's ahead of his time. And I think the idea, and I remember when he first described it to me, of having Jewish ritual objects that essentially live in the offline world but are fundamentally online, feels like it starts to open up thinking about what it might look like to live a life as truly a dual citizen. I'm just excited about it. I mean, when I think about that giving well, which is this thing, right, that you pour the water in the middle of your table and it automatically makes a donation to a food bank. I felt like, wow, I'm starting to see it, right? I'm starting to see how it's almost like when in a movie, when somebody walks out of the Matrix, into the world of flesh and blood, and somehow the worlds collide. I'm starting to see, this is something interesting is going to come. I'm particularly interested and excited about the new Apple Vision virtual reality glasses that are about to come out, because it feels to me like, not immediately, but something is going to happen there where this binary is going to break down. And I'm interested in what might come of that.
I also was really moved by that conversation because it breaks something. I mean, even in this conversation, the first however many minutes, we have still been posing offline and online as opposed sides of a duality, of a binary. And I know in my bones, and I think all of us know in our bones, that it's not. I mean, what's so funny is in Zoom space, when we're in a Zoom room, I've done a lot of workshops, and I often ask, like, where are we right now, to a room full of people in Zoom? And the rule is that it's not where are you right now, because the answer to that for Dan would be Chicago, for me would be Providence, for Miriam would be Cincinnati. But like, where are we as a group? But the reason I have to make that clarification is because we are actually, even as we're in online space in Zoom, also in offline space. Like we're doing the dual citizenship thing, but it's like we have really big legs and we're able to stand with one of our legs in one country and one in the other. It's like if we were to go to the line in Turkey, like the bridge where you like go from Asia to Europe, and we were like standing right in the middle. But that's actually like what we're doing every time we enter Zoom space, if we're to conceptualize online and offline as two sides of a bridge. But it shows that they're not. And what Brett Lockspizer shows is they're not, because we can have beautiful, sacred objects in our homes that are digital, that connect to our values, that might not look like what we expect gadgets or technology, quote unquote, to look like, but can still be that. And I think that that's where we really start to take next steps with this. And it feels like a real turning point for digital Jewish life and for offline Jewish life to reach that, because I think that's kind of what tends to happen with immigrations. There's xenophobia. I like the way you talk about that, but there's also there's just kind of a skepticism of the new place, right? So we've talked a bunch of times about how when there was a large immigration wave to the United States, the late 1800s and early 1900s, the way that established communities in Europe spoke about that was basically as, this is dog shit. This is terrible. This is totally useless Judaism. Like I'm using words like dog shit because I think it needs to be said in like severe language to encapsulate what they thought about it. Like they thought it was nothing, and should, to the point that it's like actively tragic and bad for the Jewish people, that a lot of people would be leaving that established context and going to that newer context.
By the way, I just want to note that in my family lore, I think part of my grandfather's family came from a place called something like Dogshits. And when my mom and her siblings were growing up, they thought that the family came from a place called Dogshit.
May we all one day be from such places so that we are forced to wrestle with how there is holiness even in that which we most trivialize, like dog poop. Anyway, that's a sidebar. But like, we're noticing through Brett Lockspizer's amazing tzedakah well, or giving well, something that we've known in our bones for a while, which is that when we're in a Zoom room or when we're doing all sorts of kinds of things, we are in both. And it also goes the other way. When I'm a guest, because Dan, your original question was like, Lex, do you think of yourself as a guest when you go to something offline? Like, I think I do. I feel like I'm not quite of certain kinds of offline, especially institutional communities. I think that a lot of my core conceptions come from a place where I am most regularly in partnership, in community, in connection with people through digital platforms. But there's not an ocean in the middle. That's actually where this is more fun than the immigration of the late 1800s and early 1900s. We don't have to have super long legs to straddle one on either side of the bridge or whatever, because so regularly, we've had that moment of connecting with people online, and then you're at a conference or you're at something, and wow, we're finally meeting offline for the first time. But we don't talk enough about the other direction, which is a lot of us met somebody at a conference 10 years ago or something once. We became Facebook friends or something, and we maintained a relationship. And that's the offline to online. And we don't talk about that as like, wow, what an amazing thing. But that's actually just like the end result is the same, right? Like, we've had an existing relationship that was only one level. In one case, it was only online. Then it becomes the other level. Even when we're doing offline work, if we're at a conference, if we're at a protest, if we're actually doing online work too. And there's a way in which both are starting to depend on one another. And that's when this all changes. That's when you're the established group in Europe or whatever, and you can no longer say that the new thing is dog shit, because you're actually relying on it to work your own cultural revitalization.
I was thinking about this as a dual citizen myself, and being raised up in a community of fellow immigrants, that the question of like, what's your native language? Well, what is your native language? Is it the language that's spoken in your kitchen? Is it the language that gets spoken around the community table? Is it the language of your education? Most of us start in one place, but there is a gray zone that happens, I think, in immigrant culture that is indicative of what's happening here. And I know, Dan, you're not officially a dual citizen, but as somebody who has lived significant periods of time in the land of Israel, I'm curious if people are coming to you in that same sort of hybrid way of saying, you must know more because you have some kind of rootedness or embodiment in this other place. I don't feel like I get asked that same kind of question, but I do think that Jews as a whole are being connected in this hybrid way, not just to online, offline, but also to our identity as a whole, to the greater sort of global climate, what's happening. So I'm curious if you're willing to sort of speak about what kind of questions you've been offered in that space.
When I left, and I mean, for folks who don't know, I lived in Israel for 4 years during high school. Before that, I grew up in New York. And after that, my family still lived there, but I've been in America for decades. And in those early years, it felt like you were impossibly far away, that it was something from my past that had some continuing resonance, and I would go visit every year or something, but it was still a very, very distant thing. Whereas now, I'm in a WhatsApp group with my college friends, some of whom live in Israel, many times per day. And so there's a weird way in which I feel more connected than I have in the past. And therefore, I get a lot of information. And so there's ways that it's actually less about my status as having lived in Israel 30 plus years ago than the fact that I'm actually in very close touch on a daily and multiple times a day basis with people that are physically there, that gives some people a sense that I have information that is useful, definitely gives me a sense that I have information that's useful. And What's interesting, though, is that I feel like in some ways this is obviously not the first crisis in Israel, Palestine that is in the digital age. Obviously, there have been quite a few, but somehow this feels like the first big one that is kind of in the post-digital revolution. And somehow it's feeling different to me. And it hadn't occurred to me before you asked that question, Miriam, in this conversation, that not that I'm conscious of this, but there's a certain way in which it almost feels anomalous to think about something that's hyper local, that's happening really in a physical way, in horrible ways, but in a physical reality. And yet all of us are connected to it digitally. And some people will say, if you're not physically there, you should just shut up. You have no voice. You really just should defer to the people that are physically there. And there's something about it that feels like, to me, like that's not quite right. That's to fail to understand the world that we're in now, like we've been saying, where everybody is a dual citizen. So I may be a dual citizen of America and online, but a particular Israeli is a dual citizen of Israel and online, and a Palestinian in Gaza is a dual citizen of Gaza and online.
Well, citizenship gets different for Palestinians because they're stateless, but yeah.
Granted. I mean, not trying to make a political point there. I'm just trying to, So in a sense, right, all of us live in online and are citizens of online. And how does that change the way that we think about things happening offline, especially when it has to do with conflict? So that's one thing. I mean, there's a lot of things that I've been thinking about in terms of this particular horrible situation in Israel, Palestine, and online and digital, including the conversations that are going on within the Jewish community in America. Some are positive, some are negative. I think we'll have a chance to talk about those. But those are some of my initial impressions to your question.
Well, I think there's also resistance to the hybrid nature in those contexts. You're either a Zionist or you're not one. You're either supporting what's happening or you believe in a humanitarian need or you don't. And I think that sort of falling back to really our base instinct to just stick your head in one sand and say, I'm only grounded in one place is incredibly problematic. And I think you're right, Dan, that denies sort of the global nature of the world right now and also heightens sort of the problematic nature of media and being able to open source news that everyone is a reporter, everyone can sort of share their independent experience. And that is both a powerful, beautiful thing and also skews sort of the reality, what's happening on the ground and makes it incredibly siloed in terms of perspective.
To me, a lot of what we're describing relates to the fact that we still haven't rejected this idea that the internet is virtual as opposed to real. Because to get really, maybe overly practical or pragmatic, Dan, you said you were in a WhatsApp group with people who live in Israel. If we grant that what happens in that WhatsApp group is real, then you actually are part in Israel all the time. Because there's people who are in Israel who have a phone with WhatsApp and they open it and your face is there and your words are there. So, and I apologize, I think I'm getting really nitty gritty, but things that you are doing in Chicago actually alter the space in Israel, which is to say they come through on somebody's phone, on a physical device across the world. And so when you say that it feels different this time around because you feel like you're more deeply connected, that's because you actually are. There are people looking at physical objects, whether you think that what's happening on those objects is real, but your avatar is in Israel for some people on a regular basis. Until we recognize that that is a representation of something real and not a representation of something fake, which we do treat as a binary. We continue to treat that as, so we've created an image of you. And I'm not going to say your hologram or your avatar or your picture is the same as you. But when you have people that you know are in a place and they are not only thinking about you, but they're touching your words, that shifts it. We have to notice that these screens, they're actual objects. That's where Brett Loxbeiser, they're things. They're not just the manufactured abstraction or vision of things. Often at our events on Shabbat, like we do candle lighting, and I remind people that like when I light candles in Providence, Rhode Island, if I'm close to my computer's webcam, it actually alters the light of the space in the other people's rooms that they're in. Like the light comes through and then it's a little lighter, or the coloring is a little different. And like that sounds stupid or hokey, but it's because there's a realness to it. It's because we know, like Dan, it's not just that it feels different this time. It is in fact different. There are people that have you, and you are in closer connection. There's a way in which those people in Israel, they're actually not just in Israel. They're also here because they are on your device. I mean, I've started out some of our Limud presentations. We've talked about digital Judaism, and I remember I did one in Toronto, and I started by saying, my body has never been in Toronto before, but I'm there every day. Because I am. Like, my voice is. Because people are listening to our podcast in Toronto, and because of the size of the Jewish community, there are listeners there every single day. And so, am I there? No. But am I the entire full opposite of there? Also no.
I wonder if that experience of feeling like I'm in the WhatsApp group and therefore I am privy to personal and on-the-ground information in a way that you would have access to a reporter reporting from inside a space, then skews our relationship to news and also to our identities. Because I now think that I have a secret or I have an inside track. And therefore, the way that the lens I'm going to look at the news or my own identity will change based on that. And that something that the online world does, for good or for worse, is give you this insight. And then all of a sudden, we're looking at everything through this individualized space, which I think is also a very American way of seeing things. I know because my brother is there. I know because my cousin's in the military. I know because I once, whatever it was, and almost makes then sort of neutral experiences or neutral reporting impossible. And that now we're in this place where we're having to assert who we are, but it's all based on personal experience. I find that both exciting and very scary.
What I'm trying to resist is the pressure to respond to those things or to other terrible things the way that one might have been expected to respond before the digital revolution. And I don't really have an alternative. It's not like I'm presenting an alternative. And I felt pressure throughout the last couple of months to speak publicly in ways that I didn't feel ready to. I didn't feel that I had the right thing to say. I have a lot of opinions. Anybody who wants to hear my opinions, they're welcome to come and have coffee with me in Chicago. For me right now, offline is a better place to just chat. But if the idea is that we have a take on Judaism Unbound, or I have a take in other ways as a thinker or in other ways in my professional life, I'm still working that through. And I'm still trying to figure out what's the most helpful thing that I can say at this time. I'm starting to feel like the helpful thing that I have to say is something more like, we can be thoughtful without being indecisive. I'm not sure that I can complete this thought yet, which is part of why I haven't been inclined to, write an op-ed or say something definitive. I say all this just saying that I think that some of this is just about dealing with difficult conflicts, but some of it is a specific set of things that comes from the digital revolution. Because before the digital revolution, I don't think that people were making as many statements. I don't think that there was a sense that when a crisis happened, there should be statements. Everybody should be making statements. That wasn't the world that we lived in. And I'm not sure that it's a good world to say that what people should do in a crisis is make statements. Like, I don't think that statement making is the best response to a crisis. I think doing stuff is the best response to a crisis. But I think that there's something about the coin of the realm in the digital world being posts, tweets, that makes it seem like that's what everybody should do in a crisis. And I actually think it sounds like a good idea, but at the end of the day, it may be serving us very poorly. And I would caution people to say, it's not necessarily clear that we all know what the right thing to do
I
is.
think that the role of Judaism Unbound plays a huge part of this, which is that the secret sauce is the expansive sense of what it means to be a Jew in this world right now. And the fact, Dan, that you're saying, I actually need time. Everyone needs to be at the table. And Lex, I think you and I had a lot of conversations about how to name the Torah for This Moment class and who's included, and how do you just name that there's nothing that will exclude you from this table. And that's a gift of the online world, to saying that actually, as long as you're kind to one another and that there's some shared compassion, then there's a place for you here. And that, I don't know, I think there is something about statements, because at some point you do need to say, I believe in something. Is it actually changing the face of things? I think the pace of it is really problematic, that if you don't do it within 48 hours, and at what point does it trigger the statement, and how often do you continue to do it? That you can never stay on top of it. But what is our purpose? And I think at Judaism Unbound, the purpose is expansiveness. It's the broader view. And at the end, it's meaning and belonging.
After October 7th, I consciously took either it might have been 3 days, either 2 or 3 days. And I thought through some of my initial responses, and then I communicated them. And the reason I bring that up is not that that's what I would endorse as the correct strategy for everybody. That not that, Dan, you taking much longer than that is bad. It's like, I note it because for me, that actually felt different from normal. And that's weird, right? Like that, I do think that's a result of the digital revolution, that like, we're so used to just forget 48 hours, forget 48 minutes sometimes, seeing a thing and responding. But I kind of wanted to full circle a bit to where we started this conversation as we close, which is that we were talking a little bit about COVID. I forget if Miriam brought it up first or Dan, but like that with COVID, we had this moment of intense engagement, Jewishly and otherwise, with the digital world. And our hope was that it would sustain in certain ways. I think it has, actually, in ways that we haven't noticed because we're so focused on what institutions do. I think the ways that COVID era norms of Jewish practice have sustained, and by the way, we're still in COVID era. It's middle of a boom as we record this of cases, but a different stage in the COVID era. And I think it's totally true that most organizations that have been founded around serving particular offline geographic communities, which is to say all of them that were founded before the last at least couple decades, but really all of them that were founded before the last 10 years, they have pivoted back to offline anchored programming. And honestly, there's a part of me that's really sad about that, but like, that's what they were founded to do. It's actually true from like a mission-based stance to say, like, if you were founded to serve people in Providence, Rhode Island, and you reach a point where you're operating digitally and serving people everywhere, no more and no less in Providence than anywhere else, like, there's an argument that you have strayed from your mission. Now, I think we need to critique that. I don't think that's the end of the conversation, because I've been a guest speaker at synagogues. I think we need to be undertaking a process of re-understanding what Jewish geography is. And I don't mean that in the kitschy, like, oh, your friend went to Jewish summer camp, Jewish geography. Like, I don't mean it in the party game, Jewish geography. I mean, like, the actual geography of how Jewish life and human life is constructed. Because in the same way that if you're on a WhatsApp group with somebody, you are in a more than nothing way present where they are and they where you are. All of our organizations today that mobilize digital platforms at all, they're actually not just local in the ways they thought they were. If they're a regional organization, they're not just the region they serve. They are embedded in a broader transgeographic circumstance. And I think that means that we have to reorient radically, not a little bit, radically, like start certain things from scratch, how we conceptualize what it is to serve Jews. Because we created an entire Jewish apparatus where the way that you reached people was there would be an ecosystem of synagogues and Jewish community centers and federations and everything. And you'd have them in different cities. Ideally, you'd have them even in small towns, but for pragmatic reasons, you couldn't always have them in smaller towns. But the vision was that every place that has a meaningful population of Jews would have certain things, because if they didn't have those offline things, they had nothing. I mean, they had books. They had things that you could. There were still certain forms of Jewish engagement you could do, but in terms of communal apparatus for interacting with other people, that's what you had to do. In a world where that's not true anymore, we have to rethink everything. And what that means is it's not just about building more and better things digitally. It's that communities offline need to recognize that they're actually not just of their place. I grew up in Milwaukee. I think that in many ways, I'm not only a past tense participant in that community. My mom is a member there. At the synagogue I grew up at. I regularly talk to her about it. I mean, whether that's like silly little, oh, what's the gas? Or more meaningful, what's shifting? I am currently, and certainly could be aspirationally, more involved in that community from afar than I ever would have been able to a few decades ago. Yet, I don't see that many synagogues or JCCs or otherwise conceptualizing their community as people that are in driving distance or whatever here, and their loved ones and their connections.
Like universities are doing that, right?
Yeah, universities are absolutely doing that. By the way, the moments that people actually take this step are when there's money involved. Universities, for fundraising reasons, they're ahead of the curve on this because they want to be finding donors everywhere. If that were the main thing that motivated the changes in Jewish life, I'd be kind of bummed about it. But it is in fact true that a synagogue in Milwaukee, Wisconsin could have donors spread out all over the place that have a meaningful relationship with their work today. That should excite people, that the limitations of who's going to care about your organization are no longer those who could walk or drive to it. But we're not doing that yet. I think we're afraid to do it because whenever a community in Milwaukee says we're for everyone, well, the communities in Providence might not be happy if Lex and everybody like Lex doesn't join the Providence stuff because we're still connected to our childhood synagogue. So we're all afraid of poaching. We're all afraid of not playing nice. And so we continue to operate with this outdated notion of where Jewish life lives. And it doesn't actually serve anyone. We're holding ourselves back from everybody having more options and more meaning and more purpose and more community and more justice-driven programming in their life because we're afraid of what would happen if we sort of break that apparatus open. And it would break it. If every synagogue in the country did not think about itself as like a certain locality synagogue, that shifts everything. And if every federation, I want us to consider the downsides of if we don't break it. Because I think if we don't, we're going to continue to just peter out as these communities all are scraping and clawing to do a million things with very limited resources, when we could instead have amazing organizations that specialize in X, Y, or Z, that, wow, this community in Cincinnati, they're the best in the country at a particular kind of Shabbat afternoon experience. And they create, and all the other synagogues within 500 miles, they tell their people, we're not going to offer Shabbat afternoon stuff because you should participate in this. We're not doing it because we think that digital Judaism, quote unquote, is about tech and gadgets and not about geography. The core changes of our time are geographic. And until we realize that, we're going to continue falling short.
I agree with what you're saying. I just want to add briefly one thing, which is, I think we've talked about before in the show, that it's not just because people think of digital as tech. It's because there's this mentality, like you were saying earlier, to not poach. And I've always hated the idea that the way that you want to try to control people's choices is by limiting their options. I think that is just such a cowardly approach to this work, to say that we're going to try to keep Jews where we want them by getting mad at people who offer them an alternative. And I think that's a big part of it as well.
I believe that the collaborative approach is the correct approach. I think that it's theologically correct, and I think it's practically correct. I think it's financially correct. I think in all those places, I feel like we're all islands, and our aspiration is to be some kind of Pangea or a reverse Pangea, right? That will connect on these jagged edges and actually be able to serve. But right now, if you're looking at your toolbox and you're in a congregation or you're in a JCC, I think that you look down and say, I only have these tools. Like, what are you expecting me to do, Lex? You're asking me to add this a whole other set of things or to be expansive. And then I think that's right that you'll steal from me. You'll steal what I have instead of saying, what we're doing, I think, is building a mishkan, a tabernacle. And in our text, there's Bezalel, whose job we say is an artist, but really he's an arranger. And he gets all everyone's gifts and he's like, okay, this chunk of stuff works in this kind of place and this will work here. And most of the things that you're offering will be used, but there's also going to be this junk pile that y'all can help yourself to afterwards. And I think that there's this understanding that if we could believe truly in that abundant philosophy that we're building something in a wilderness that would get us closer to it, I think the fear is real. The fear that someone will say something that isn't on brand for us and that would be problematic, or that someone would come in and not understand the culture of a place. I think that there's a lot of barriers to being able to believe that we're building a tabernacle.
Yeah. The push that you're offering around collaboration as the best way, financially, morally, ideologically through this, I really hope we can start to figure out more effectively. We are going to close this episode. I know it's been a whirlwind of stuff. It's also been a little bit of a gap between our Digital Judaism episodes and this debrief. So I really encourage folks to go back and listen to some of those great conversations. The ways in which our conversations with Molly Tulsky, with Miriam Anzovin, with David Zvi Kalman, with Brett Loxbreiser, who we did mention, but with Olivia Devora Tucker, with Samantha Frank and Rena Singer, I really think that they offer a ton of wisdom on this, and I hope that people will revisit those. Please, as always, especially now, send us notes with your own visions about this. Part of the magic of Digital Judaism is that we are in, again, real relationship with a greater span of geographic locations and of people who listen to this podcast than we ever could be if we were recording a radio show in some local population's radio station. So be in touch, send us your visions, send us your ideas for how we continue navigating forward as Judaism Unbound, but also as a broader Jewish collective. There's a whole bunch of ways for you to be in touch with us. There's our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. There's our email inboxes, Dan at Judaism Unbound, Lex at JudaismUnbound.com. I'll add Miriam at JudaismUnbound.com. All of that is so critical. And truly, the emails we receive have often played a direct role in how we conceptualize our work, the podcasts we offer, the presentations we give when visiting places, all of that good stuff. So be in touch. Another push, go to JudaismUnbound.com/classes. We have some incredible classes on offer. I'll be selfish for a second and say that one of them is called Mishnah Unbound that I'm teaching. Just a really short 3-week taste of this, this word Mishnah that many folks have heard but don't really know what the heck it's referring to. So if that's you and you want to dive in, I hope you'll sign up for my class. There's also some amazing other classes you can learn about at JudaismUnbound.com/classes. So we're going to close things out. We really, really appreciate sharing this unit of conversations with you. We want to remind folks that even though it is the new year, we still accept donations anytime, not just the end of the year. And so JudaismUnbound.com/donate is the place where you can do that. And just remember that it goes so far. So please, whether it's $1, $1,000, $1 million, especially those, but if you're able to take a step and support our work, it means the world to us. And the last thing we'd say is that, of course, support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.